NBC News is reporting tonight that President Trump's lawyers are preparing answers now to questions submitted by Robert Mueller's people. That's according to a source familiar with the matter. And there's still no agreement for the president to be questioned in person. However, Trump told Fox today he'll do, you never know what this means. I'll do whatever is necessary. That means whatever his lawyers agree to do. Go ahead. Here he is.
Have you thought again about sitting down for an interview or write written questions or any type of hybrid approach there?
Well, it seems ridiculous that I'd have to do it when everybody says there's no collusion, but I'll do what is necessary to get it over with.
What do you make of that, Zerlina? I mean, it has so many millions of traps in that. Yes. I'll do whatever's not. I mean, whatever my lawyers say I might have to do to avoid a subpoena. In fact, even to honor a subpoena. Now that I've got 5 people in the Supreme Court that will help me not have to have a subpoena, you may not have to do anything.
Look, that was what that whole fight was about, Chris. It was about avoiding the consequences that could be potentially down the road for him at the end of this investigation.
You mean having a packed Supreme Court?
He has Justice Kavanaugh there as a backstop.
Who says presidents have enormous power beyond our imagination.
Correct. And so that's really problematic on the one hand. But on the other hand, when he basically answers by saying yes, no, and maybe, when we're talking about whether or not he's going to go sit down with Robert Mueller, and we know that he's probably not going to do it because he can't tell the truth.
They tape those interviews.
Right,
it's called perjury.
He cannot tell the truth. Additionally, I think he's very scared of the Russia investigation because it doesn't just have one tenet. Now we're in the Southern District of New York, where you have Michael Cohen cooperating with the Southern District on Trump Organization and Foundation. You have his accountant cooperating.
Right.
And so you have the accountant, you have the lawyer. I mean, you just have you need one more person, and you have the perfect setup for a joke, but not a good one for Donald Trump.
My setup was to set up this is shaping the battlefield, like they used to say back in the Iraq wars and the Gulf Wars, and shaping the battlefield. He's now basically like Groucho Marx saying, I'll fight anybody in the House for $1. He wants to fight Eric Holder. He wants to fight Gary Cohn. Why does he get up in the morning with so many people on his enemies list? He begins to sound a little bit crazy, that having that many enemies he wants to duke it out with now.
Well, I think he might be a little crazy. I think it's a mistake to apply a lot of strategic insight to President Trump. He reacts with instinct. He is driven by his own needs and emotions. So he's angry at people. He goes to a safe venue, either a hockey arena full of Republican primary voters or Fox and Friends, and he vents about them, or Twitter, I guess I should say, too. So I'm not sure there's a method to the madness. I think it's just a lot of madness to the madness. And he, again, is the most transparent president we've ever had because he just emotes whatever he's thinking.
Well, now that I've got you, and you are an expert at this, as long as he can win the minute, as long as he can be firing in every direction in any second we live on this planet together with him, as long as he can do that, keep shooting and shooting and shooting, Pocahontas this, liar this, whatever it is, as long as he keeps shooting in every direction, can anybody beat him? Is there anybody who can stand up to him in that crossfire of craziness that he's able to explode in every minute he's in combat? Mike Murphy.
I think he's done. I mean, he's got this, I give him credit. He has this Rasputin mind twist on a lot of the Dems because, wait a minute, Nate Silver said he was going to lose and he won. He's got magic. He can't be stopped. His numbers are terrible. The special elections have gone badly. The midterms look dim. And he only operates in the demographic cul-de-sac of the Republican primary, where he's declining a little bit and will more if we lose on Election Day in the midterm. So I think that his card trick will wear out, and the demography of America is still changing quickly against him. So I'm not sure he will be the nominee or run in 2020. I think we have a lot of things we're going to learn after the one mark-to-market event that counts in politics, Election Day, coming very quickly now.
Well, Trump was also asked about the Washington Post reporting yesterday that he had spoken to Jeff Sessions' chief of staff, Matt Whitaker, about replacing his boss as Attorney General. While Trump wouldn't say what he plans to do about Sessions, the question provoked a rant today again about Russia, and that investigation is bothering him.
I never talk about that, but I can tell you Matt Whitaker's a great guy. I mean, I know Matt Whitaker, but I never talk about conversations that I had. But, the Washington Post gets it wrong a lot. That's the only thing.
Yeah, but the conversation is that you are in active talks to replace the Attorney General of the United States.
I'm not doing anything. I want to get the elections over with. We'll see what happens. I'm very disappointed that we go through this witch hunt, this ridiculous witch hunt. There is no collusion. There's no collusion. There is collusion with Hillary Clinton and the Russians, but there's no collusion with the Republicans, and there's certainly no collusion with Donald Trump, and everyone knows it.
Well, that's unfortunate information to get from the president himself. Anyway, today the Wall Street Journal reported that President Trump is considering as many as 5 candidates as his new AG on the assumption that Jeff Sessions will leave his post later this year. Susan, what's the reporting on that? It seems to me he wants to clear the deck in some sort of Saturday Night Massacre to come this fall. It would come in November, which is the right time to have such a thing on the Nixon schedule. He gets rid of AG, then what?
Well, that has a lot of steps in it. I'd say to just start with step one, which is I think it's unlikely that Jeff Sessions is still the Attorney General a month after Election Day. He's been trying to hold on, I think, until after that, and President Trump has gone along with that. But his answer that you just played was not very reassuring for any job security for Jeff Sessions, saying, I don't want to talk about that. Let's just get through the election. What happens after that, I don't know, because the president has some challenges when it comes to getting another nominee, for instance, confirmed through the Senate, even if it's a Republican Senate, and it is clear that he is quite concerned about a Russia investigation that seems to be coming to a conclusion. The fact that Mueller is talking to his lawyers so seriously about whether he'll testify or not is a sign that Mueller is getting close to the end of that part of his investigation.
Well, he's threatening all the time to knock off Sessions. But what about Rosenstein, his deputy? It seems to me he's giving him a warm hand now. What's the game? And who's playing who? Is Rosenstein playing the president to keep the job, or is the president keeping him calm before he basically executes him at some point politically?
I think they've become. I think that situation has calmed down, and that Rod Rosenstein seems to be in better favor after that moment when we were all sure he was going to the White House to resign. So that has been perplexing. I think in some ways maybe the Brett Kavanaugh story overtook the Rod Rosenstein story and gave a cooling off period that has preserved his job.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.